In the spring of 1998, 39-year-old social worker Sabrina Sanders had seen her fair share of relationships. So after her recent divorce, the Oklahoma resident was looking forward to living life on her own terms.
I had a wonderful relationship with my ex-husband, but his dreams weren't my dreams, and we were going separate ways. So I was excited about being single. I had just moved into my new place, and love was the farthest from my mind.
That is, until a handsome man in a security guard uniform approached Sabrina on moving day.
I was unloading clothes out of my car, and I had dropped some clothes. And as I reached down to pick up the clothes, I saw this man coming towards me. He had a big, beautiful smile.
The man introduced himself as Frederick G. Brooks, a 36-year-old Army officer by day and security guard by night.
He gave me his phone number and said, "I'm an officer. If you need me for anything, I live right upstairs," letting me know that he would be looking out for me. It made me feel safe because this was my first place by myself.
While settling in over the next few days, Sabrina couldn't help but notice Frederick around their apartment complex.
One morning, I noticed that Frederick was at his truck, and there was a young lady with him. And the girl appeared to be pretty young, and I thought that maybe it might have been his daughter.
Curious, she asked him about the young girl later that day.
He said she was one of his soldiers' daughters who had some issues. And he was talking to her and counseling her, and he was taking her back. I thought, wow, what a good guy.
As the weeks passed, Sabrina found herself bumping into Frederick a little more often.
A lot of times we would sit out at the pool and he would tell me, "You're such a great woman, you're beautiful, look at your body," and everything that he would tell me was just building me up.
I told Sabrina to take it slow. She just got out of a relationship. But she seemed to be happy that she had met him, and she just told me that he was a really nice guy.
I start feeling in my heart that, this is someone that I'd like to really get to know, and he seems to be very interested in me.
Sabrina soon discovered they had much in common. She opened up to Frederick about her recent divorce and her 20-year-old son.
He told me that he was also going through a divorce, and they had a little boy together, and that his oldest son lived back east.
Frederick also revealed he had been in the military for 16 years and loved computers. But his true passion was law enforcement.
His dream was to be a Texas State Trooper. I was impressed with that.
Before Sabrina knew it, they were spending every moment they could together.
I had fallen madly in love with Frederick. I wanted to be with Frederick all the time.
I'm very overprotective of my mother, but when I met Frederick, I automatically liked him. He was a perfect gentleman, and you could tell my mother was excited.
Once Frederick's divorce was final, the couple agreed it was time to take the next step in their relationship.
He said we might as well get a place together. I thought it was a good idea because we were together all the time. So we set up house, and we enjoyed doing it.
And for the next 2 years, the lovebirds slowly made a nest for themselves.
I told Sabrina, I wish I could find me a man like that. I mean, he was such a great guy. He treated her like a queen. Anything that she needed, he would do.
By April 2001, Frederick was officially ready to retire from the Army. After receiving an honorable discharge a few weeks later, he decided it was time for a change of scenery.
We had recently taken a trip to Austin, Texas. He loved it. He said, "Let's make that our home." And I liked that because I would be next to my sister, and he would have an opportunity to become a state trooper. I felt like that was going to be our beginning, our new start.
After Sabrina Sanders and her boyfriend Frederick Brooks moved to Austin, Texas, she noticed his perfection only became more pronounced.
Frederick loved computers, and he would fix them for my sisters, and he would put them together for my son. So he was the computer guy in the family.
But Sabrina couldn't help but notice how frequently Frederick would hole up alone in their computer room.
He was spending a lot of time in there, and I could wake up at 3 in the morning and he was still on the computer.
I set her down and I said, Sabrina, it's a big change when you get out of the military. It's like a culture shock. So just give him time to kind of move into being a civilian.
Yeah, I convinced myself that that was his hobby. So I didn't get mad at him.
And 1 month later, Sabrina forgot all about it when Frederick had a surprise for her.
We went into a jewelry store and we're looking at rings, and he tells me, pick a ring. I chose a ring, and he got on his knee and he proposed to me.
When my mother told me she was engaged, I felt like Frederick was the perfect guy for her. It made me feel wonderful that she was happy.
Life only got better for the couple when that October, Frederick received a letter from the sheriff's office that he'd been accepted into the academy. Although he was slightly disappointed when he learned he'd have to start as a jailer upon graduation.
He wasn't excited about being a jailer, but he felt like, well, I'm in, and this is good.
So in the spring of 2002, after Frederick graduated from the academy, he and Sabrina went through with their planned nuptials, tying the knot in a small church wedding.
It was very, very beautiful. It was small, but it was touching. I was happy, and I was excited to start my life as Mrs. Brooks.
Sabrina looked beautiful. She looked like a little young girl at her wedding. I felt like she had finally found somebody that was going to make her happy.
Unfortunately, the honeymoon didn't last long. When just a few months after the wedding, Sabrina fell ill and underwent a partial hysterectomy.
Frederick was right there when I came out of recovery, hugging me and holding me, and he was a perfect husband. And when I was discharged, he picked me up.
But the following day, her pride in Frederick quickly vanished.
He said he had to get out for a little while, and he didn't get back to the house until really late. And I was really upset. I asked him, why didn't you even call to check on me? And he said, I had to get out. I was furious. I was hurt. I thought, something's wrong. Something's not right with this.
So one night, Sabrina decided to creep into Frederick's computer room. And what she walked in on would send her entire world spinning out of control.
I felt betrayed. I felt hurt. I felt like I was sleeping with the enemy.
In the summer of 2002, Sabrina Brooks snuck into her husband Frederick's computer room and was shocked at what she saw.
Frederick was sitting in front of the monitor, and I noticed on the monitor there was a young female, and she was dancing. And I said, what are you looking at? And how old is she? Because she looked really young. He said, well, you know, you're out of commission because of your surgery, and I have to do what I have to do. I felt hurt, and I was mad. I was mad because what I saw on that screen was what I was thinking. He had been looking and chatting with different women.
Still healing from her surgery, Sabrina was in no condition for a blowout argument and decided to let it go for the time being.
I felt that I needed to concentrate on my health. I needed to get back to the old Sabrina because I knew something was going on.
I told her, right now you're not feeling good, and some men do stuff like that, So I said, just calm down because the surgery had her on pins and needles and emotional anyway.
But the humiliation ate away at her.
As months passed, I could not understand his behavior. I couldn't understand why this man that I thought I knew so well was changing. He was getting to act like he didn't even care, like I wasn't important anymore.
So one morning in May 2003, after Frederick left for work, Sabrina decided to see what else her husband was up to.
I got on the computer and I typed in his password and it said wrong password. And at that time it prompted me. It said, would you like to change the password? And I changed the password.
When his emails finally loaded, Sabrina was overcome by a wave of nausea.
I noticed a lot of different emails, but one particular screen name stood out because there was a lot of emails and they were recent. One said, I cannot meet you on Thursday because I have to be at school. I can't miss any more school. I was thinking she's a college student and I was very angry. This explained why he was acting strange. I knew there was another woman and he was having an affair. I felt like I was sleeping with the enemy. I felt like I was sleeping with someone that I didn't know.
When Frederick called her later that morning, she couldn't contain her anger or her discovery.
He said, what's wrong? I said, I'm in your email account and I'm reading your mail and I need to know who this person is. And when I looked again, he had sent out an email to this person and told them, if someone contacts you, don't talk to him. It's my ex-girlfriend and she's crazy. I added this person's name to my instant messenger. And when she logged on, I started talking to her and she told me that you're his crazy ex-girlfriend. And I said, no, I'm actually his wife.
While defensive at first, the student finally began answering Sabrina's questions.
So I am typing, have you met him? And I said, where'd you meet him? And she said, he picked me up from school. And she described my place. And then she told me he took her to a hotel.
But before Sabrina could wrap her head around the betrayal, the girl would reveal that Frederick wasn't just a liar and a cheater. He was something much worse.
It was just so unbelievable.
We take an oath to do the right thing. He's hurting people.
It hurt me so bad that he would do that. He didn't seem like that type of person.
Sabrina Brooks was appalled at her husband Frederick's obvious lies as she continued her line of questioning online with his mistress.
I'm thinking she's probably a college student. And she named off the school, and it was the high school. I asked, how old are you? And she says, I got sick to my stomach. She said when they got to the hotel, he forced himself on her. And I asked her, have you talked to anyone? Have you told anyone this? And she says, no, I'm scared. And I told her, I said, you've been violated. I got out of my computer chair and I cried from the depths of in here somewhere.
If Frederick was truly an internet predator, Sabrina knew she needed to act fast.
He knew I was talking to this girl. And he came home early that day. I told him, I'm out of here. I'm leaving. I packed up what I could and I moved in with my sister. And I said, you know, I have to do something. I have to say something. And I called her mom. I spoke with her mother.
She urged the woman to call the police, and they quickly interviewed both the victim and Sabrina.
When I spoke to the victim, she informed me that she had developed a relationship with a gentleman in a chat room. He suggested that they meet. So she told him he could come by the school and pick her up. They drove to the hotel. They had sexual contact with each other. They left the hotel room and drove by his residence. Then he had dropped her off back at the school. Then Sabrina provided me with a lot of information. All the information led me to Frederick Brooks.
And after confiscating Frederick's computers, police had all the evidence they needed.
He had approximately 94 contacts between the victim and himself. Also, there was pornography, and there were pictures of young women.
On July 24th, 2003, Frederick Brooks was arrested in uniform at his own department for sexual assault of a child.
It hurt me so bad that he would do that because he didn't seem like that type of person. And I had him around my nieces. Could have been one of them, you know. He could have did that to one of them. And I felt so bad for this young girl.
I went from seeing Frederick as a role model to seeing him as a monster. It was shocking that someone in uniform would do something like this.
I couldn't find any criminal history on Frederick. He was an outstanding employee. From my experience of being in law enforcement, I rarely see this. It's very serious to be in that position and then betray public trust.
And it wasn't long before he was linked to another incident in which he'd groomed a 15-year-old girl online.
No other women have come forward, but sometimes this behavior can go on for long periods of time without knowing because the victims are afraid to come forward.
On November 5th, 2004, Frederick G. Brooks was officially charged with 2 counts of sexual assault of a child. He pled guilty to avoid a trial. Looking back, Sabrina can't help but view her entire marriage to Frederick with new eyes.
I remember all the times that Frederick was on the computer. He was out there preying on little girls who were online. And I remember in Oklahoma, this young girl getting inside his truck. I wonder now, was she another victim?
5 days later, Frederick Brooks was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
I feel like I played a major part in getting him off the streets, and I also feel like there's probably a lot of other girls that are saved because of that. If I had to do it all over again, I'd do it the same way.
Today, Sabrina is not sure what motivated Frederick to go from protector to predator.
I believe that the protector part was basically a lure. To commit those type of crimes, something has to be seriously wrong. I don't know what.
I'm very proud of Sabrina. She's endured a lot of things that most people wouldn't have been able to endure. But she's strong. She's made it through.
But Sabrina still can't believe how Frederick was able to dupe so many.
Even the agency that he worked for didn't believe it. But it's easy to be fooled. And for a long time, I felt like I'm not going to ever trust again. But God has a way of carrying us through.
Growing up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 18-year-old Lisa Yarbrough was raised with good manners and a strong faith in God.
I actually prayed when I was a young teenager that I didn't want a lot of boyfriends. I wanted the one that I was supposed to meet and marry, and that was it.
And one fall evening in 1991, while on a walk with a friend, it seemed Lisa's prayers were answered.
This guy on a bike races by and goes, "Hi, ladies," and startled us. So we just kind of giggled at ourselves. The guy comes back and he's like, "I didn't mean to startle you ladies. I'm Dennis Bradford."
Lisa was instantly taken with the 23-year-old's good looks and Southern charm.
He was very handsome. Just by the way he said, "I apologize, ladies," really caught my attention immediately because he was a gentleman.
The girls invited him to a local hangout. And over drinks, Dennis told Lisa he had recently moved from Texas and was studying to become a stonemason.
We got along great. We talked about things that we like to do. I grew up on a farm, so I'd tell him about the slow country life, and he would tell me about life in the big city. He was just so fun to be around. I wanted to get to know him better.
And it wouldn't take long. Soon, Lisa and Dennis were spending every day together. And Lisa quickly realized Dennis just might be the one.
I liked his personality. He always had a smile on his face. So I knew right away that we really clicked.
So when Dennis proposed in the winter of 1992, Lisa didn't hesitate to say yes. 1 month later, she and Dennis made it official.
You know, we did have very limited funding, so my cousin did all of the dresses. The flower arrangements were flowers that we picked off the side of the road on the way to the church. It was a nice little country wedding, and we were happy.
Eager to start their new lives together, the young newlyweds moved from the big city onto a 400-acre farm in Bonnerdale, Arkansas, owned by Lisa's grandmother.
She had a big farmhouse up on the hill, and we had a trailer next door to her house. Dennis would help out with the chores around the farm. Get the tractor started up and get the cows up, mend fence, all that kind of stuff. Working on a farm is really hard work.
Dennis seemed to enjoy country living, and later that year, the couple was thrilled to welcome a son into their world.
I was extremely excited. I always wanted children. Dennis seemed to be very happy about having a family.
But Lisa started to notice a change in Dennis. A marked departure from his usual wide-as-a-country-mile smile.
I could tell as time went on that the country life maybe didn't suit him. I was seeing a depression come out. He would become just so quiet and reflective. I kind of felt like it was just a culture shock for him, and he was adjusting.
But the following year, Lisa gave birth to a daughter and noticed that when Dennis was with his children, his lighthearted nature returned. He became an active and doting dad.
I knew my dad as a fun, loving, kind, gentle person. I remember he would read to me. He would tell me stories. He'd just immediately make me laugh.
But what should have been an idyllic time was tainted by Dennis's unpredictable mood swings.
One night, we were just wrestling around playing, and I got him pinned down, and we're laughing. Then he's smiling up at me, and he said, "I just wish I was dead." And he pushed me away from him and got up, walked out of the house. I was so angry because I knew a lot of people that would give anything to have the life that he had.
But Dennis returned 15 minutes later with a full apology.
He was just like, I don't know where that came from. So it was a bad moment.
Although Dennis had his moments, they were few and far between.
For the most part, there were no bumps in the road. We got along great. I felt like he was my best friend.
And Dennis could always make Lisa laugh with his stories. But one afternoon, Dennis went a little too far with one of his tall tales.
He's kind of leaned up against a fence post with a smile on his face. And he said, you know that little girl that they talk about on TV? You know that girl that got kidnapped? And he said, I did it. I was like, you did nothing of the sort, you know? Why are you trying to get a rise out of me right now? You know, he's kind of like, yeah, that was a bad joke, and kind of like left it at that.
Bad jokes aside, Lisa started to notice that things with Dennis were a little more off than ever. And it wasn't just his stories.
He would have these quiet, you know, reflective times, and then they would end up with him, you know, leaving and going out to drink and not even telling me where he was going. And then I wouldn't see him till 6 o'clock the next morning. I would just sit and worry.
Though Dennis was a loving father, Lisa could tell that her once perfect marriage was coming to an end.
I would tell him our relationship can't continue like this. Something's got to change. We had started talking about going our separate ways, but maintaining a friendship so that, you know, we could raise our kids together. I didn't want them not having a relationship with their dad.
So in the fall of 1994, after 2 years of marriage, Lisa and Dennis moved their family back to Hot Springs and decided to separate, but continued to live under one roof for the sake of their children.
I felt like I was just in my life and he was in his life. I was very disappointed. But I had to remind myself that I deserve to be happy.
Lisa decided it was time to focus on what she wanted in life.
Me, my friend, and my sister decided that we were going to go and have a few drinks and play pool and just have a good time, girls' night out.
But when Lisa came home, she saw a strange side to Dennis.
All the lights were off. It was completely dark, and flipped on the light, and he's sitting in a chair right across from the doorway. And he just had this blank look on his face. And he's like, where have you been? I was like, you have no right to be mad at me whatsoever. And then he got to where he was laughing, he's smiling, he's like, you're right, you know, I don't know what I was even thinking, getting mad, you know. He's like, I guess I see how it feels, you know.
And Dennis still pulled the occasional all-nighter, but on April 16th, 1996, he didn't return until 10 a.m., the longest he'd ever stayed out.
It was concerning, but at the same time, you know, I'm just like, I'm not going to let this ruin my day. Had the kids out in the yard, we're playing. It's a beautiful day.
But Lisa's beautiful day was about to come to an abrupt end.
This car pulls up, and these two ladies get out of the car, and they're like, here's your husband, Dennis Bradford. I was like, yeah, Dennis is my husband.
And then one of the women delivered a shocking blow.
She said, we're undercover detectives. Your husband raped a woman last night. And it felt like somebody had just kicked me in my chest. I was shocked. Dennis is such a good-looking, charming guy. Why would he have to force anyone? It didn't fit at all.
Eager to cooperate, Lisa led the detectives inside and woke up Dennis.
He got up, and they snap a picture of him with a Polaroid camera and just say, well, you'll hear from us, and walk out the door.
Dennis insisted it must be a mistake.
And he's like, You know me better than that. I would never hurt anybody.
When 2 weeks passed without word from the detectives, Lisa started to give Dennis the benefit of the doubt.
He swore to me. Didn't happen. I was like, okay, I'll believe that it didn't happen.
Lisa clung to the hope that the police had been wrong. But soon, this tall tale would come back to haunt Lisa and her family in the most earth-shattering way.
I moved the curtain aside, and there's police cars as far as I can see.
I started screaming, "You can't take my dad. You can't take my dad."
I wanted it to just wake up from the bad dream that I seemed to be in.
In the spring of 1996, 2 weeks had passed since Lisa Bradford's life was turned upside down. Her husband Dennis stood accused of kidnapping and raping a woman in their small Arkansas town, which he firmly denied.
I didn't think that he was completely innocent, but what he was being accused of did not match the person that I knew him to be.
Then on May 1st, 1996, Lisa's quiet morning was interrupted by a loud banging on the door.
I reached over and I moved the curtain aside, and there's police cars as far as I can see.
Lisa and her 2 young children watched in horror as their father was hauled away in handcuffs.
I followed him out the front door and started screaming, "You can't take my dad. You can't take my dad." I didn't know what was going on. I just thought, this is the last time I'm ever going to get to see my dad.
Dennis was formally charged with kidnapping and rape, swabbed for DNA, and locked up in jail pending trial. After a long roller coaster ride, Lisa knew her marriage was finally over.
I was very upset. I was very hurt. I couldn't, in any way, comprehend that he did these things to her.
But when Dennis's trial began on January 22nd, 1997, the victim refused to have a rape kit administered, and the rape charges were dropped. But the kidnapping charges remained.
Why wouldn't she submit to being tested? It's not that I didn't believe her, but I didn't know what he had done. A huge part of me just wanted it to be over, to wake up from the bad dream that I seemed to be in.
Meanwhile, 500 miles away in a small Texas town, Jennifer Schuett had spent the last 7 years in her own bad dream. On August 10th, 1990, as 8-year-old Jennifer slept peacefully in her bed, a man slid open her window and lifted her out.
I thought I was dreaming. And I came to and opened my eyes, and he was staring at me. I tried to scream, but he immediately covered my nose and mouth and put me in his car. He's telling me he was an undercover cop, that I just needed to be quiet.
But when the man pulled over several miles from her home next to an open field, Jennifer instantly knew something was very wrong.
Immediately, he ripped my panties off of me.
The man brutally raped Jennifer. And to ensure her silence, he slit her throat and left her in the field to die.
I would try to scream, and I couldn't figure out why no sound would come out. I had just enough strength somehow to just throw my hand on my neck. And I felt this gaping wound. And I just knew at that point, I'm gonna die. I mean, I would go in and out of consciousness. And I could hear children playing off in the distance. And I just wanted to get help so badly. The help was right there. But I had no way to get anyone's attention because I couldn't even lift my head up. I didn't know that it was halfway cut off.
But miraculously, after 12 hours, children playing nearby found Jennifer, still alive. She was immediately transported to the hospital, while police combed the field for evidence.
They located her clothing that she was wearing on that night she was abducted, along with a pair of men's underwear and a T-shirt. but back in 1990, there was no DNA testing done at the time.
Police spent years following leads that went nowhere. The monster that attacked her was never found. But Jennifer refused to give up the hunt.
It didn't matter to me how many years had passed. I didn't want to give up. I didn't want him to be able to hurt anybody else.
Back in Arkansas, Lisa Bradford was heartbroken. On January 28, 1997, her husband Dennis was convicted on the kidnapping charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison.
It was a very surreal experience, but I knew that I had to move on with my life. I was trying to be a strong parent for my kids.
Lisa landed a new job as a hotel desk clerk and even began dating. So she wasn't at all upset when Dennis made plans to marry a woman he wrote to from prison.
I had already had a boyfriend and moved into a place together. So that was okay, you know, that he had established a relationship.
The couple filed for divorce, but Dennis was hoping to remain in his children's lives. And that happened sooner than anyone expected. 3 years later, Dennis was released from prison for good behavior.
I thought he was gone for 12 years. I was kind of surprised, but, you know, okay with it too. I always wanted him to have that relationship with his children.
Dennis moved to Little Rock, and Lisa allowed him to visit with his children on a monthly basis.
It was just a different chapter in our lives. It did feel like all of the bad was behind us.
Until October 2009, when Lisa received a panicked phone call from her ex-father-in-law. And in a matter of seconds, Lisa's life would change forever.
He said, protect your children. Protect the children. It's all over the news.
There was a circus out in front of the police department. This made national media.
To be looking at someone that you have searched for years, it just felt so surreal.
On October 13th, 2009, Lisa Bradford received an unimaginable phone call from her ex-father-in-law.
He was very emotional, and he said, protect your children. Protect the children. It's all over the news. Dennis committed a horrific crime.
It seemed Dennis had been arrested again. This time for the kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder of an 8-year-old girl nearly 19 years prior, Jennifer Schuett.
It had been so long, it was like, well, this is almost unsolvable. We knew that they had done all the previous forensics that were available back in 1990, but I wanted to go in with fresh eyes.
So detectives submitted previously unprocessed DNA into CODIS, the National DNA Database. And in September 2009, they got a hit. Dennis Earl Bradford. DNA from his 1996 arrest had been linked to Jennifer's vicious attack.
It devastated me. Everything that I ever knew was just blown away. Anybody could be an evil monster.
I looked over to the TV. I was like, there goes that wonderful, fun, spectacular dad walking across the screen in handcuffs. It was a little unbelievable, like it was hard to grasp.
While Lisa and her children struggled with this new reality, Dennis was extradited to Dickinson, Texas, where Jennifer was waiting.
We put him into a room, a special room that had mirrors so that Jennifer could see him. So it was a pretty good feeling.
It just felt so surreal to be looking at someone that you have searched for years, like an arm's length away from you. I never cried. I just stared at him. That was like the best moment.
As Jennifer looked her attacker in the eye, 500 miles away, Lisa couldn't help but wonder if the story Dennis had told her that day on the farm was his way of confessing to her years ago.
I was saying to myself, why didn't I just play detective or something? Why didn't I question him? Why didn't I see that?
Suddenly, everything made sense. Dennis's depression, his newfound alcoholism.
It kind of clicked that it wasn't that he was missing his old life and stuff. He was ashamed of himself, trying to run away from it.
And in May of 2010, he finally succeeded. After confessing to the kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder of Jennifer Schuett, Dennis Bradford hanged himself to death in his jail cell. Today, Lisa thanks God every day that Jennifer Schuett lived to see her attacker in custody.
I'm in awe of her strength, and for her to be able to tell her story, she's amazing.
I'm here to encourage other people to share their stories and to seek justice. That's what I'm alive for.
And Lisa has tried her best to show that strength in her own life, although it's been hard for her to trust others.
It's still hard. Imagining the person that I knew is also this person that committed this heinous crime. But at the same time, we just gotta keep moving forward.
The vast expanse of the South Pacific Ocean has always held a dual nature in the human imagination. On one hand, it represents the ultimate paradise, a sprawling canvas of endless blue waters, pristine coral reefs, and lush, volcanic islands completely detached from the frantic pace of modern civilization. It is a place where time seems to slow down, where the trade winds offer a gentle respite from the world beyond the horizon. But on the other hand, this exact same isolation carries a profound and terrifying undercurrent. When you are separated from the rest of humanity by thousands of miles of deep, unforgiving ocean, the isolation that once felt peaceful can rapidly transform into an inescapable prison. Geography itself becomes the perfect accomplice to exploitation. It is within this profound isolation, specifically within the American unincorporated territory of American Samoa, that one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters in the history of modern United States federal justice unfolded. This is not a story of a single act of violence committed in the heat of passion, nor is it the tale of a conventional serial killer stalking victims in the shadows. Instead, it is a meticulously orchestrated nightmare of human trafficking, a sprawling enterprise of forced labor, and an unimaginable campaign of physical and psychological terror enacted upon hundreds of vulnerable individuals who simply sought a better life. The village of Tafuna sits on the island of Tutuila, the main island of American Samoa. To the outside observer in the late 1990s, Tafuna might have seemed like a quiet, developing tropical community, characterized by its proximity to the international airport and its gradual shift towards light industry and commerce. It was here, beneath the swaying palm trees and the watchful gaze of the surrounding mountains, that a South Korean businessman named Kil Soo Lee decided to establish his empire. He named his enterprise the Daewasa Garment Factory. On paper, and to the local authorities who welcomed the promise of economic development, Daewasa appeared to be a standard manufacturing operation, a testament to globalized industry reaching even the most remote corners of the Pacific. It represented jobs, export revenue, and the integration of American Samoa into the lucrative international textile supply chain. However, behind the corrugated metal walls and the heavily guarded perimeter of the Daewasa compound, a vastly different reality was being engineered. Kil Soo Lee was not merely an entrepreneur navigating the complexities of global trade. He was the architect of a modern-day slave camp, operating with an audacity and ruthlessness that would eventually shock the highest echelons of the American legal system. The victims of this elaborate trap were over 250 workers, the overwhelming majority of whom were young women traveling from Vietnam, alongside a smaller contingent of workers from China. To understand the sheer cruelty of this tragedy, one must first understand the profound vulnerability of these individuals and the immense weight of the hopes they carried across the ocean. In the late 1990s, the prospect of securing employment under the jurisdiction of the United States, even in a remote overseas territory, was an incredibly powerful lure. Kil-Soo Lee and his network of recruiters capitalized precisely on this desperation and ambition. They painted a vivid, irresistible picture for these women, promising them stable employment, fair wages, and a legitimate pathway to elevate themselves and their impoverished families out of economic hardship. For many of these women, signing a contract to work at the Daewoo factory meant mortgaging their futures, taking on significant debts, and leaving behind everything they knew and loved. They boarded flights crossing the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean not just as laborers, but as primary breadwinners, carrying the weight of their family's survival on their shoulders. Yet, the illusion of this American dream evaporated the very moment their feet touched the volcanic soil of American Samoa. The descent into subjugation was not a gradual decline, but an immediate and violent severance of their basic human rights. Upon their arrival at the factory compound in Tafuna, the workers were systematically stripped of their autonomy. Their passports, identification papers, and return tickets were swiftly and forcibly confiscated by the factory management. In an instant, they were rendered stateless and entirely dependent on the very people who intended to exploit them. Stripped of their documents on a tiny island thousands of miles from their homeland, escape became a physical and bureaucratic impossibility. The factory gates closed behind them, effectively sealing them within a jurisdiction of absolute tyranny where the laws of the United States seemed to hold no power, and the decrees of Kil-Soo Lee became the only ruling authority. The living conditions inside the Daewoo compound were designed to break the human spirit. The workers were confined to squalid, overcrowded barracks that lacked even the most fundamental standards of hygiene and decency. They were subjected to a life of severe deprivation, frequently denied adequate food, and forced to endure conditions that fostered illness and despair. The promise of fair wages, the entire reason they had undertaken this perilous journey, was completely abandoned. The women toiled endlessly behind sewing machines, producing garments for international markets, while their own bodies withered from malnutrition and exhaustion, receiving absolutely no compensation for their agonizing labor. They were prisoners in every sense of the word, entirely cut off from the outside world, unable to speak the local language, unable to contact their families, and entirely at the mercy of a management structure that viewed them not as human beings, but as disposable machinery. The psychological toll of this existence was immense, but it was merely the baseline of their suffering. The physical violence utilized to maintain control over this captive workforce was brutal and unrelenting. Kil-Soo Lee established a regime of terror, employing a cadre of local guards and enforcers to ensure strict compliance. These enforcers, numbering roughly around 20, operated with the explicit blessing and encouragement of their employer to use whatever means necessary to suppress dissent and force production. As the months dragged on, the factory transformed into an environment of constant fear, where minor infractions or simply failing to meet impossible production quotas could result in severe physical retribution. The workers were trapped in a cycle of starvation, exhaustion, and the perpetual threat of assault. The culmination of this systematic abuse reached its horrifying apex on the 28th of November, 1999. The catalyst for this explosion of unprecedented violence was a mundane business failure. A large international shipment of garments had fallen behind schedule. The economic pressure of this delayed order caused the thin veneer of corporate legitimacy to shatter entirely, revealing the unadulterated savagery of Kil-Soo Lee's operation. Driven by the financial implications of the missed deadline, he made a decision that would cement his operation as a site of historical atrocity. He gathered his local enforcers and issued a directive that essentially authorized a localized massacre. He instructed his guards to utilize absolute and unrestrained violence against any worker who failed to comply, explicitly assuring his enforcers that he would bear the full responsibility even if their brutal actions resulted in the death of the women. This decree stripped away any remaining restraint, granting the guards a horrifying mandate of impunity. What followed was a scene of unimaginable carnage within the confines of the factory. The 20 enforcers, armed with heavy, rigid polyvinyl chloride pipes, descended upon the defenseless, starving workforce. They launched a coordinated and savage assault against the female workers, striking them indiscriminately, with the hard plastic pipes. The confined spaces of the factory floor became a landscape of sheer terror as the women, weakened by months of abuse and malnutrition, desperately tried to shield themselves from the devastating blows. The violence was not meant merely to punish, but to completely subjugate and physically break the workforce. The heavy pipes shattered bones, caused severe lacerations, and inflicted profound internal injuries. The air was filled with the sounds of blunt force impacts and the screams of trapped victims who had absolutely nowhere to run. The aftermath of this calculated assault was devastating. Numerous workers sustained critical, life-altering injuries, both physical and psychological. In one particularly horrific instance, highlighting the sheer ferocity of the attack, a young Vietnamese woman was struck with such immense force that she suffered catastrophic trauma to her face, resulting in the permanent destruction and loss of one of her eyes. Witnesses who survived the ordeal and those who later investigated the scene struggled to find the vocabulary to articulate the sheer scale of the brutality, frequently describing the events of that day not as a labor dispute or a riot, but as a systematic massacre executed against a captive and defenseless population. The factory floor was stained with the blood of women whose only transgression was seeking an honest living. This catastrophic event on the 28th of November, 1999, stands as the grim centerpiece of the Daewoo tragedy. It represents the ultimate intersection of corporate greed, human vulnerability, and the catastrophic failure of local oversight. For an agonizing period following the assault, it appeared as though this atrocity might simply be swept under the rug, hidden away in the deep Pacific, obscured by bureaucratic delays and the geographical isolation of American Samoa. The local authorities, ill-equipped or perhaps unwilling to confront the magnitude of the crime occurring in their own backyard, moved with a painful sluggishness that only compounded the suffering of the victims. The women remained trapped, broken, and terrified, entirely unsure if the outside world would ever learn of their existence or the horrors they had endured. However, the sheer scale of the violence and the undeniable evidence of widespread human trafficking eventually pierced the veil of isolation. The profound severity of the situation, coupled with the fact that these crimes were occurring on United States territory, eventually triggered a massive federal response. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was compelled to intervene, crossing the ocean to dismantle the operation and rescue the surviving workers from their tormentors. The subsequent investigation would unravel a complex web of deceit, exploitation, and extortion, ultimately leading to the arrest of Kil-Soo Lee in the year 2001. To ensure a fair and rigorous judicial process free from local influence, he was extradited across the ocean to the state of Hawaii, where the full weight of the federal justice system would finally be brought to bear against him. The ensuing legal battle culminated in the year 2005, resulting in a landmark conviction. Kil-Soo Lee was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, found guilty on severe charges encompassing human trafficking, forced labor, and extortion. While this sentence represented a monumental victory for federal prosecutors and a measure of justice for the survivors, the legacy of the Daewoo factory extends far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The case served as a brutal awakening for the United States government and the international community, laying bare the terrifying reality that modern slavery could thrive within the supply chains of everyday products, even under the shadow of the American flag. It became a pivotal catalyst for sweeping legislative reform, fundamentally shaping the creation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the year 2000, a landmark piece of legislation designed to safeguard immigrant laborers from precisely the kind of exploitation endured by the women of Daewoo. Furthermore, it stood as a tragic and enduring lesson for nations exporting labor, highlighting the desperate need for rigorous oversight to protect their most vulnerable citizens from falling prey to international syndicates of exploitation. But before the legislation, before the federal trials, and before the rescue, there was simply the island, the factory, and the terrifying realization of hundreds of women that they had walked willingly into a meticulously designed nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. This is the story of how that nightmare was built, how it violently erupted, and the arduous path required to finally bring it to an end. The late 1990s in Vietnam was a period defined by profound economic transition and a desperate yearning for upward mobility. While the nation was beginning to open its doors to the global market, the benefits of this newfound economic liberalization were starkly uneven, leaving the vast agrarian hinterlands largely untouched. For the countless families residing in the rural provinces, daily life remained an exhausting struggle for basic survival. It was within these impoverished communities that the concept of labor export began to take root, not merely as an option, but as an absolute necessity. Sending a family member overseas to work was viewed as the ultimate sacrifice to lift an entire household out of generational poverty. The victims of the Daewasa tragedy were primarily women drawn from exactly these vulnerable circumstances. In the traditional cultural fabric, the burden of filial piety often falls disproportionately on the shoulders of the daughters and mothers. When medical bills accumulated or the harvest failed, these young women were expected to sacrifice their own comfort for the collective survival of their kin. The prospect of earning highly coveted United States dollars represented a life-altering opportunity to save their families. To fully grasp the insidious nature of the trap laid by Kil Soo Lee, one must deeply understand the immense financial investment required for these women to embark on this journey. The recruitment process was a complex, highly predatory system designed to extract maximum profit from the most desperate individuals before they even left their home country. To secure a position at the Daewasa factory in American Samoa, these women were required to pay exorbitant recruitment fees that were utterly incomprehensible to families surviving on mere dollars a month. They were forced into a perilous cycle of debt, mortgaging their meager plots of ancestral land and borrowing heavily from predatory local lenders at crippling interest rates. This staggering financial burden effectively chained the women to their overseas employment long before they ever boarded an airplane. They departed their home villages knowing with absolute certainty that failure was not an option. If they returned home empty-handed, the debt would completely consume their families, leading to permanent financial destitution. This terrifying fear of failing their loved ones was the invisible but unbreakable chain that Kil Soo Lee would exploit with devastating efficiency. The recruiters acting on behalf of the Daewasa factory masterfully manipulated these aspirations, painting a meticulously crafted illusion of the American dream. The destination they were promised was American Samoa. To the women sitting in small recruitment offices in Vietnam, the intricacies of United States territorial law and the geographical realities of the South Pacific were unknown concepts. All they heard were the words American and United States territory. They were promised a modern, well-regulated working environment governed by robust labor standards, comfortable living quarters, and a continuous flow of income. The brochures completely masked the dark, unregulated underbelly that Kil Soo Lee had deliberately constructed. Alongside the Vietnamese majority, a smaller but equally vulnerable group of workers from China was also drawn into this sophisticated web of deceit. Driven by similar economic pressures, they bound themselves to the Daewasa enterprise. Despite linguistic barriers, they shared a profound and tragic commonality as economic refugees willing to endure severe hardship in exchange for a dignified wage. They were united by their desperation, their heavy debts, and their absolute reliance on the integrity of their employer, a reliance that was commodified and weaponized against them. The physical journey from the rural landscapes of Asia to the remote islands of American Samoa was an exhausting and disorienting ordeal. For the vast majority of these women, this was the first time they had ever left their home provinces. They navigated unfamiliar international airports, endured long flights across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, and experienced the profound psychological dislocation of being completely unmoored from everything they knew. As the airplanes descended towards the island of Tutuila, the sheer isolation of their new reality began to materialize. American Samoa is a small, intensely isolated volcanic archipelago surrounded by thousands of miles of deep blue ocean. This geographical isolation was not a coincidental detail. It was a fundamental component of Kil Soo Lee's strategy of control. In a mainland city, an exploited worker might eventually find an avenue for escape. But on a tightly knit island territory, the ocean itself acted as an insurmountable prison wall. Even if a worker managed to flee the factory compound, there was nowhere to run and absolutely no way to return home. They were marooned in a tropical paradise rapidly transforming into an engineered hell. The illusion of the American dream was shattered with brutal efficiency almost immediately upon their arrival at the factory compound in the village of Tafuna. The transition from hopeful, debt-burdened migrants to captive laborers was neither gradual nor subtle. It was executed through a swift and calculated administrative process designed to instantly strip the women of their identity, their autonomy, and their legal standing. As soon as they entered the Daiwusa facility, the management implemented their primary mechanism of control. The workers were ordered to surrender their passports, their identification documents, and their return airline tickets under the guise of administrative safekeeping. In reality, the confiscation of their documents severed their only legal tether to the outside world. Without their passports, they ceased to be documented guest workers. They were instantly reduced to the status of undocumented captives, entirely dependent on the goodwill of the people who had orchestrated their entrapment. The realization that the exit doors had been firmly locked behind them washed over the workers with a terrifying finality. The promises of comfortable conditions evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of the corrugated metal walls that surrounded them. The immediate environment they were thrust into further confirmed their darkest fears. Instead of the clean, regulated dormitories they had been promised, the women were corralled into squalid, intensely overcrowded barracks. The living conditions were deliberately kept at a level of severe deprivation, designed to systematically break down the physical and mental resilience of the workforce. They were forced to exist in a state of constant physical discomfort, subjected to inadequate sanitation, poor ventilation, and a pervasive lack of privacy. The food provided to them was scarce, nutritionally deficient, and sometimes entirely withheld as a form of collective punishment. The basic human right to adequate sustenance was weaponized as an additional tool of control. But the most devastating betrayal, the one that triggered the deepest waves of panic and despair among the workforce, was the sudden realization that they were not going to be paid. The entire foundation of their sacrifice, the massive debts they had accrued, and the immense hopes of their families rested entirely on the promise of regular wages. Yet, as the weeks turned into months of grueling, relentless labor behind the sewing machines, the promised paychecks never materialized. Kil-Soo Lee's management team offered a continuous stream of fabricated excuses, citing delayed shipments and vague bureaucratic hurdles. The women were forced to work exhausting shifts entirely uncompensated, while the crushing weight of the interest on their debts back home continued to multiply exponentially. This systematic theft of their wages plunged the workers into a state of profound psychological torment. They were acutely aware that every day they spent trapped in the Daiwusa factory without pay was a day their families slipped further into financial ruin. The fear of what was happening to their loved ones back in Vietnam and China became a constant, agonizing hum in the back of their minds. They were paralyzed by a complex web of terror and impossible choices. If they protested the lack of pay, they risked severe physical retaliation from the brutal guards who constantly patrolled the perimeter of the factory compound. If they somehow managed to escape the heavily fortified walls, they would simply be undocumented aliens wandering on a small, remote island, completely unable to earn the money required to save their families from the ruthless predatory lenders waiting patiently back home. They were trapped in a paradox of exploitation, entirely unable to stay and endure the abuse, yet entirely unable to leave without condemning their families to generational ruin. Kil-Soo Lee understood this psychological paralysis perfectly and wielded it with precision. He knew that the massive debts the women carried were stronger and more restrictive than any physical chain or locked door. He exploited their deep love for their families, their fear of failure, and their total lack of legal recourse to extract an atmosphere of absolute submission. The Daiwusa factory devolved into an ecosystem of total human exploitation, a desolate place where human beings were consumed, broken, and discarded solely to maximize the profit margins of international apparel contracts. The hundreds of women from Vietnam and China had traveled across the vast expanse of the globe seeking a legitimate, dignified pathway to a better life, only to find themselves tragically ensnared in a highly sophisticated, meticulously organized system of modern-day slavery operating brazenly on sovereign American soil. Their multifaceted identities as devoted daughters, loving mothers, and hopeful dreamers were violently and methodically stripped away by the factory administration. In the wake of this systematic dehumanization, all that remained was the exhausting, inescapable reality of endless, completely uncompensated manual labor, the severe deterioration of their physical health, and the looming, ever-present threat of catastrophic, unimaginable violence that was slowly building pressure within the compound, a dark storm of brutality that would soon, inevitably, erupt upon them all. The transition of the Daiwusa factory from an engine of economic exploitation to an active, violent dungeon was a process that mirrored the escalating desperation of its proprietor, Kil-Soo Lee. While the initial months were defined by the psychological crushing of the workers, the systematic theft of their passports, the denial of wages, and the forced confinement in squalid, unsanitary barracks, the atmosphere within the compound eventually reached a volatile breaking point. The factory was a pressure cooker where the combination of intense physical exhaustion, severe malnutrition, and the mounting, suffocating anxiety over unpaid wages and predatory debts created an environment of permanent, low-level instability. The workers, though physically broken by their grueling shifts, were becoming increasingly aware of the utter hopelessness of their situation. This awareness was not merely a matter of personal suffering. It was a realization that their sacrifice had been a complete, calculated fraud. As the months of labor without compensation stretched on, the silence of the factory floor, once characterized by the rhythmic hum of sewing machines, began to be punctuated by the quiet whispers of terrified, desperate women who realized they had been sold into a living nightmare. Kil-Soo Lee's management style was built upon the maintenance of this fear. He understood that in order to extract maximum labor from a workforce that knew it was being cheated, he had to instill a sense of absolute, overwhelming terror. To achieve this, he had recruited a cadre of local enforcers, a group of approximately 20 individuals from the surrounding island community. These men were chosen not for their industrial expertise or their administrative capabilities, but for their willingness to exert raw, physical force upon the women. By utilizing local enforcers, Lee created a deliberate buffer between himself and the direct execution of violence, a strategic layer of separation that he hoped would insulate him from direct accountability while ensuring that the discipline within the compound was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. These guards were instructed to maintain order at any cost, and over time, their presence transitioned from mere surveillance to active, systematic intimidation. They walked the aisles of the factory with heavy, intimidating gazes, carrying themselves with the authority of men who knew that the laws of the outside world, or at least the enforcement of those laws, were suspended within the corrugated metal walls of Daiwusa. The friction that ultimately triggered the explosion of violence on November 28, 1999, was rooted in the cold, unfeeling demands of international commerce. A significant, high-value shipment of garments had fallen behind schedule, threatening the factory's precarious financial standing and, more importantly, the personal profits and ego of Kil-Soo Lee. For an entrepreneur like Lee, the workers were not individuals with rights, hopes, or physical limitations. They were line items in a ledger, disposable components in a machine. When the production quotas were not met, he did not view it as a failure of management or a consequence of the starvation wages he provided. He viewed it as an act of defiance, a personal insult from a group of people he considered entirely beneath him. The delayed shipment became the catalyst for him to cast aside any remaining pretense of corporate legality and unleash the full, unadulterated extent of his cruelty. He did not simply push the workers to work faster. He decided to crush the spirit of any potential resistance through an act of overwhelming, public violence that would serve as a terrifying, permanent warning to every woman in the compound. On the morning of that fateful Sunday, the factory floor was heavy with an unnatural tension. The guards, seemingly emboldened by a new sense of urgency from the management office, were unusually aggressive. Kil-Soo Lee summoned his enforcers and, in a display of cold, calculated malice, issued his direct order. He did not couch his demands in corporate euphemisms or vague instructions. He was blunt, explicit, and utterly indifferent to the human consequences. He told them that they were to beat anyone who failed to comply, anyone who slowed down, or anyone who dared to show signs of defiance. He declared that he would take full responsibility for their actions, even if their brutality led to the death of the workers. This statement was the final piece of the puzzle that turned the factory into a slaughterhouse. By providing his enforcers with a blanket guarantee of impunity, Lee had effectively authorized a localized, internal massacre. He had weaponized the guards, turning them from supervisors into conduits for his own unrestrained sadism, confident that the isolation of the island would protect him from the consequences of his commands. The violence that followed was not a riot or a spontaneous flare-up of tempers. It was a choreographed, systematic assault. The enforcers entered the main production area, and the air immediately filled with the sharp, sickening sound of rigid, thick polyvinyl chloride pipes striking human flesh. The women, already weakened by months of inadequate caloric intake and relentless labor, were completely defenseless. The pipes, which had been sourced as tools for the factory, were now used as instruments of torture. The guards moved with a coordinated, ruthless efficiency, striking the women across their backs, limbs, and torsos, forcing them to continue working even as they collapsed under the weight of the blows. The screams of the women echoed off the metal walls, but there was nowhere for them to retreat. The exits were blocked, the perimeter was secured, and the surrounding island remained oblivious to the carnage taking place within the compound. The scene was described by those who witnessed the horror as nothing short of a massacre, a systematic attempt to break the humanity of the workforce through sheer, overwhelming physical pain. As the assault continued throughout the day, the level of violence escalated to a truly grotesque level. The guards were no longer just disciplining. They were inflicting life-altering injuries with total abandon. The brutality was concentrated, intense, and meant to be witnessed by every other worker in the room to ensure maximum psychological impact. One young Vietnamese woman, who had been a model of diligence despite the atrocious conditions, was singled out for an act of particular savagery. A guard swung a heavy, thick pipe with such focused force that it struck her directly in the face, causing immediate, catastrophic trauma. The impact shattered bone and tissue, resulting in the permanent destruction of her eye and leaving her with an injury that would serve as a lifelong, visual testament to the terror of that day. She was left on the floor, bleeding and in agonizing pain, while the work continued around her under the watchful, menacing eyes of the enforcers. Many other women suffered deep lacerations, broken limbs, and severe contusions that would leave them permanently scarred, both physically and psychologically. The sight of their peers being systematically beaten, the knowledge that any one of them could be next, and the overwhelming realization that their employer was willing to commit murder to keep them in bondage shattered the last remnants of the women's ability to resist. The factory floor was transformed into a landscape of broken, sobbing human beings who continued to sew because they were too terrified to stop. The silence that fell over the room after the initial, deafening chaos was perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire day. It was a heavy, suffocating silence of total, forced submission. The workers realized that they were entirely alone, abandoned by the governments who had signed their labor contracts, trapped on a remote island by a man who had explicitly authorized their killing, and surrounded by guards who were all too happy to obey his orders. The event of November 28th was not just a singular act of violence. It was the definitive moment in the Daiwasa tragedy where the illusion of legality was stripped away, revealing the naked, brutal truth of the slave camp that had been built on American soil. The trauma of that day would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, a nightmare that seemed to have no end, as the sun set over the island of Tutuila and left them in the dark, trapped with their tormentors and the agonizing physical reminders of the violence that had been visited upon them by a man who considered them nothing more than inventory to be managed, broken, and ultimately discarded. The aftermath of the November 28th massacre at the Daiwasa factory created a temporal void where the horror of the event collided with the agonizing inertia of the local legal and political systems. For the survivors, the days following the violence were a blur of physical pain, profound psychological shock, and a paralyzing sense of abandonment. Their bodies were covered in the dark, purple bruises and jagged welts left by the PVC pipes, while their minds remained locked in the moment of the assault, replaying the sounds of the strikes and the visceral screams of their colleagues. The factory itself had become a site of concentrated trauma, yet the work continued with a chilling, mechanical relentlessness. Kil-Soo Lee, far from being deterred by the brutality, seemed further emboldened. He moved through the facility with the arrogance of a man who believed he had successfully tested the limits of his power and found that there were no consequences. The enforcers, now transformed into permanent agents of state-sanctioned terror, monitored the workers with an increased intensity, their presence serving as a constant reminder that the violence of the 28th could be repeated at any moment with even greater severity. In the immediate wake of the violence, the plight of the workers was trapped behind the complex, often impenetrable geography of American Samoan jurisdiction. The territory, while technically under the oversight of the United States, operated with a degree of local autonomy that often left federal authorities at a significant distance. The local government and law enforcement, either through a lack of resources, systemic corruption, or an uncomfortable deference to the perceived economic necessity of the factory, initially displayed an alarming lack of urgency in addressing the allegations of abuse. The cries for help from the survivors were, for a period, silenced by a wall of bureaucratic indifference. This phase of the tragedy remains one of the most maddening aspects of the entire affair. The victims were physically present, their injuries were undeniable, and their testimony was harrowing, yet the wheels of justice refused to turn. They were living in a paradox where the protection of American law was theoretically their right, yet in the practical, daily reality of their confinement in Tafuna, that law seemed entirely absent, failing to acknowledge their suffering or hold their tormentors to account. The intervention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not come as a swift, cavalry-like rescue, but rather as the result of the inevitable, slow-building pressure caused by the sheer magnitude of the crime. As news of the conditions began to slowly trickle out from the compound, often through the immense courage of individuals who risked everything to contact outside organizations, or through the sheer visibility of the survivors' injuries, the federal authorities could no longer look away. The transition from local inaction to federal intervention was a protracted process, characterized by the meticulous gathering of evidence. Federal investigators had to navigate a landscape where intimidation was the primary language. The survivors, who had been conditioned to view every authority figure as a potential enemy and who lived under the constant threat of retaliation against their families back in Asia, were initially terrified to speak. They had been told that if they revealed the truth, the consequences would be catastrophic, and they had seen the violence that corroborated these threats. Breaking this cycle of silence required a level of patience and empathy that went beyond standard police work. The agents had to prove to these women that the federal government was not just an extension of the same power structure that had exploited them, but a force capable of guaranteeing their safety and dismantling the apparatus of their enslavement. The investigation itself was a grueling process of documenting the systemic nature of the exploitation. It was not merely enough to prove that an assault had occurred. The prosecution needed to build a case that encompassed the entire spectrum of human trafficking. They needed to map the journey of the women from their home villages, document the predatory recruitment fees, catalog the confiscation of their passports, and record the systematic wage theft that underpinned the factory's profitability. Each piece of evidence was a testament to a deliberate, calculated, and long-term criminal enterprise. Every document recovered, every statement taken from a survivor, and every internal record of the Daewoo factory served to strip away the thin veneer of legitimacy that Kil-Soo Lee had tried to maintain. The investigators uncovered a world of financial manipulation where the very act of bringing these women to the island was a profit-making endeavor, with the labor itself being secondary to the extortion of the debt-trapped workers. The depth of the depravity was staggering, revealing that the violence on the factory floor was not an anomaly, but a necessary instrument in a larger, darker mechanism of modern bondage. The turning point in the investigation arrived when the testimonies of the survivors began to coalesce into a cohesive, undeniable narrative of institutionalized cruelty. The young woman who had lost her eye, along with scores of others who bore the physical and psychological scars of their time in Tafuna, found the strength to testify despite the lingering, deep-seated fear of their former master. Their stories were consistent, graphic, and devastatingly human. As the federal case gained momentum, the structural supports of Kill Sue Lee's empire began to collapse. The realization that they were no longer dealing with a localized labor dispute but with a major federal human trafficking case meant that the resources and authority of the United States government were now fully focused on the pursuit of justice. The logistical challenge of managing such a large group of witnesses, many of whom were victims of severe trauma and had limited legal status, required a monumental effort. The federal government had to provide support, housing, and legal counsel for hundreds of individuals who had been rendered stateless by the confiscation of their passports. This period of the investigation was marked by an intense focus on victim protection, a recognition that the survivors were not just witnesses in a trial but individuals whose lives had been shattered and who needed to be shielded from the trauma of the judicial process. Throughout this period, Kill Sue Lee and his defense attempted to obscure the reality of their actions through a variety of tactics, ranging from legal maneuvers to the continued, subtle intimidation of those who stood against them. However, the sheer weight of the federal investigation proved impossible to counteract. By the time the case was ready for trial, the evidence of his role as the primary architect of this slave camp was overwhelming. The decision to remove him from the territory of American Samoa and relocate the proceedings to the federal court in Hawaii was a strategic necessity. It ensured that the trial would be conducted in a venue where the potential for local, extra-legal interference was minimized, providing a neutral ground where the rule of law could finally be asserted. This transition of the legal battlefield was perhaps the most crucial step in ensuring that the trial would not be compromised by the same factors that had allowed the abuse to continue for so long in Tafuna. The move to Hawaii also signaled to the survivors that they were now under the full protection of the American judicial system, far removed from the isolated, dangerous environment of the factory compound. It allowed the prosecution to present their case in a standard federal forum where the rules of procedure, the presence of the media, and the oversight of a federal judge provided a stark contrast to the closed, shadow world of the Daiwasa facility. The investigators and prosecutors spent months preparing, ensuring that every detail was accounted for, from the medical records of the injured to the financial ledgers that detailed the illicit profits. They were building a case that would not just result in a conviction but would serve as a permanent legal record of the crimes committed, a document of truth that would stand against any future attempts to minimize or deny the atrocities. As the trial date approached, the focus remained on the victims, ensuring that their voices would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The quiet strength of these women, who had been brought to their knees by unimaginable cruelty and had fought their way through it, would become the ultimate, insurmountable barrier to Kill Sue Lee's efforts to escape the consequences of his actions. Their journey from the rural provinces of Asia to the federal courtroom in Honolulu was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a long and arduous path that was nearing its final, definitive destination. The investigation had been long, the path to justice had been fraught with obstacles, but the foundation for a landmark moment in the history of American justice had finally been firmly laid. The federal courthouse in Honolulu served as the stage for the final reckoning, a stark, antiseptic environment that stood in profound contrast to the hot, humid, and terror-filled factory floor in Tafuna. For the victims of the Daiwasa tragedy, the journey to Hawaii represented far more than a simple change of venue. It was the transition from the status of property to the status of plaintiffs, from the voiceless captives of a madman to the central witnesses in a historic federal trial. The courtroom was packed with representatives from the media, human rights advocates, and federal officials, all gathered to witness the unraveling of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for far too long. Kill Sue Lee, who had once held absolute power over the lives of hundreds, now sat at the defense table, stripped of his authority and forced to confront the individuals he had dehumanized. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with the weight of the testimonies that were about to be heard, a collective gravity born from years of suppressed trauma and the long-awaited arrival of accountability. The prosecution opened its case with a meticulous, narrative-driven presentation that traced the entire history of the Daewoo factory from its deceptive inception to the violent climax of November 28, 1999. They understood that to secure a conviction, they needed to humanize the statistics. They needed the jury to see not just a labor dispute or a business failure, but the individual lives that had been systematically dismantled. The courtroom became a space where the harrowing details of the captive's existence were articulated into the legal record. When the survivors began to take the stand, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. Their testimonies were not dramatic, theatrical performances. They were quiet, deliberate, and devastatingly honest accounts of their experiences. They spoke of the recruitment promises that had lured them from their homes, the visceral terror of the passport confiscations, and the daily, grinding reality of hunger and forced labor. Each witness added a layer of detail to the portrait of the factory, confirming the existence of the barracks, the lack of food, and the omnipresent threat of physical violence that had defined their lives in American Samoa. The highlight and most traumatic portion of the trial involved the testimonies regarding the events of November 28. The prosecution presented the evidence of the assault with a cold, clinical precision, contrasting the brutal reality of the violence with the callous, detached nature of the orders given by Kill Soo Lee. When the survivors testified about the morning of the massacre, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. They described the arrival of the guards, the heavy PVC pipes, and the systematic, methodical nature of the beatings. The testimony of the young woman who had lost her eye was a profound moment of emotional gravity. As she recounted the moment the pipe struck her face, the jury was confronted with the physical reality of the cruelty that had been inflicted upon her. Her injuries served as an indelible, visual piece of evidence that no legal maneuver by the defense could ever obscure. The survivors, who had once been broken into submission by the fear of their employer, now stood tall, using the power of the truth to dismantle the very system of oppression that had once held them hostage. The defense for Kill Soo Lee attempted to deploy a variety of strategies to distance him from the direct violence, painting the factory as a high-pressure commercial environment where the management had lost control over a difficult and unruly workforce. They sought to portray the guards' actions as impulsive, localized events for which Lee could not be held directly responsible. However, this defense was systematically dismantled by the prosecution, which presented clear evidence of Lee's direct, active, and ongoing control over every facet of the factory's operations. They produced internal documents, records of communication, and witness statements that placed Lee squarely at the center of the decision-making process. The prosecutors illustrated that the violence was not an aberration but a deliberate management tool, a fundamental component of the factory's business model. They demonstrated that Lee had explicitly provided his guards with the authority to use violence and had effectively created a vacuum of accountability where he could profit from the suffering of others while insulating himself from the repercussions of his decrees. The trial proceedings were a masterclass in the methodical application of federal law to a crime that had crossed the boundaries of international commerce, labor rights, and basic human dignity. As the days of testimony turned into weeks, the evidence became an insurmountable wall. The prosecution systematically built a case of human trafficking, forced labor, and extortion, connecting each individual act of abuse to the larger, central intent of the defendant. The jury, presented with a deluge of consistent, corroborated testimonies and physical evidence, was given a clear view into the dark, hidden ecosystem of the Daewoo compound. The defense's efforts to portray Lee as a misunderstood entrepreneur faded in the face of the overwhelming, factual reality of the crimes. The trial concluded not just with a condemnation of an individual, but with a firm, public affirmation of the rights of the victims. It was a victory for the rule of law, demonstrating that no matter how remote the location or how marginalized the victims might be, the federal justice system had the capacity to reach across the ocean and deliver accountability. The sentencing phase, which occurred in 2005, brought the legal process to its final, definitive conclusion. When the judge delivered the sentence of 40 years in federal prison for Kill Soo Lee, the courtroom reacted with a profound, quiet sense of relief. The sentence was a heavy, substantial punishment that reflected the severity of the crimes, the systematic nature of the trafficking, and the lasting, irreparable harm inflicted upon the survivors. It sent a powerful, unambiguous message to anyone who might consider utilizing such methods of exploitation in the global supply chain. For the survivors, the verdict was the validation of their suffering, a recognition that what had been done to them was not just a tragic mistake, but a serious crime against humanity. The long, arduous road that had begun in their rural villages continued through the gates of the Tafuna factory and traveled across the ocean to the federal court in Hawaii had finally reached its end. The judge's words were the final punctuation mark on a case that would remain a landmark in the history of American jurisprudence. Throughout the entire trial, the focus never wavered from the victims. Their resilience, their bravery in the face of their former tormentor, and their commitment to seeing justice served were the true driving forces behind the successful prosecution. They had navigated a legal system that was entirely foreign to them, translated their experiences through interpreters, and bore the heavy burden of reliving their trauma in a public forum. Yet, they did so with a dignity that commanded the respect of everyone in the courtroom. Their stories, once hidden away in the isolated barracks of American Samoa, were now part of the permanent record, a testament to the fact that their humanity could never be truly erased, no matter how hard their enslaver tried to break them. The trial in Hawaii was not just about the conviction of a single individual. It was a profound act of restorative justice that centered the voices of those who had been silenced. As the proceedings wrapped up and the final documents were signed, it was clear that the Daiwasa case had fundamentally changed the landscape of labor rights and victim protections, establishing a new, higher standard for accountability that would influence the legal responses to future cases of human trafficking for generations to come. The nightmare that had begun in the remote village of Tafuna had been brought into the light, analyzed, dismantled, and officially condemned, providing a measure of closure for the hundreds of women whose lives had been forever altered by the tragedy. The closing of the legal chapter in the Daiwasa tragedy did not mark the end of the narrative, but rather the beginning of a profound process of reflection and systemic evolution. As the echoes of the 40-year prison sentence for Kill Sue Lee faded from the Honolulu courtroom, the international community and the United States government were left to grapple with the haunting reality of what had occurred on the island of Tutuila. The Daiwasa case was not an isolated aberration. It was a symptom of a deeply flawed global economic system that frequently prioritized profit margins over the fundamental dignity of the human beings producing the goods consumed in developed nations. The legacy of the factory in Tafuna is etched into the very fabric of how modern labor rights are understood, litigated, and protected today. It serves as a stark, permanent reminder that the distance between a corporate boardroom and the site of human bondage is often far shorter than one would like to believe. The tragedy fundamentally recalibrated the legal landscape, serving as a critical impetus for the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the year 2000, a landmark piece of legislation that remains the cornerstone of modern efforts to combat human trafficking. This legal shift was not merely a bureaucratic adjustment, but a seismic change in the moral and regulatory posture of the United States. Before the revelations of the Daiwasa case, the mechanisms for identifying, reporting, and prosecuting such cases were fragmented, inconsistent, and often localized. The tragedy in American Samoa highlighted the urgent need for a cohesive, centralized federal approach that could overcome geographical and administrative barriers. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act provided the tools and the framework necessary to hold perpetrators accountable even when they operated across international borders or within the jurisdiction of remote territories. It established rigorous standards for victim support, emphasizing the necessity of providing survivors with the resources required to recover from the trauma of their exploitation. For the women who had endured the violence in the factory, the act was a belated recognition of their humanity and a commitment to ensuring that no other workers would be left to face such horrors in silence. It transformed the victims from anonymous, disposable laborers into protected individuals with rights that were enforceable, tangible, and defenseless against the reach of federal law. The case also provided an invaluable, albeit agonizing, lesson for the countries that were primary sources of exported labor. For nations like Vietnam, The tragedy was a profound awakening to the systemic risks faced by their citizens who sought opportunities abroad through unregulated or exploitative channels. It catalyzed a period of intense institutional self-reflection regarding the oversight, vetting, and protection of laborers traveling to work for international corporations. The tragedy underscored the necessity of robust governmental engagement with the conditions in which their citizens were employed, shifting the perspective from viewing labor export solely as an economic benefit to acknowledging it as a profound moral responsibility. The Daiwasa tragedy forced countries to reconsider the vulnerability of their citizens and the role that international syndicates play in trapping them within systems of debt and violence. It served as a grim catalyst for improved bilateral agreements, stricter oversight of recruitment agencies, and the establishment of hotlines and support networks to assist those working far from home. Beyond the legislation and the policy changes, the enduring legacy of the Daiwasa story lies in its profound impact on the human rights movement and the global consciousness surrounding modern slavery. It dismantled the comfort of the belief that such atrocities could only exist in the annals of history or in the most destabilized, war-torn regions of the world. By occurring in an unincorporated territory of the United States, the case shattered the geographic insulation of the American dream, proving that human rights abuses could thrive even under the protective umbrella of developed nations. It forced activists, policymakers, and consumers to look more critically at the supply chains of the products they used every day. The tragedy brought into sharp focus the reality that every garment, every item of clothing, and every product manufactured in the global economy is produced by human hands, and that without rigorous, independent oversight, those hands can easily be shackled. The case turned the spotlight on the hidden costs of cheap production and the true, human price of corporate greed. For the survivors, the path toward healing was an arduous, lifelong endeavor. The trauma of the November 28th massacre did not end with a guilty verdict in a court of law. It remained a persistent presence in their lives. The loss of dignity, the physical scars from the PVC pipes, and the emotional wreckage of their experience were challenges that required immense resilience to overcome. Many of the women returned to their home countries after the trial, carrying with them the heavy burden of their experiences, but also the hard-won strength of having stood up against their oppressor. They became symbols of resilience, proving that the human spirit, while capable of being broken by extreme malice, is also capable of profound recovery. Their collective courage was the most essential element of the entire ordeal. Without their testimony, the factory would have continued to operate in the shadows, and their voices would have been permanently silenced by the weight of their isolation. Their persistence transformed their victimization into a public demand for justice that no authority could ignore. As we reflect on the history of the Daiwasa factory, it is vital to avoid the temptation to look back with a sense of detachment. The temptation to view this as a concluded chapter, a closed case in the records of history, ignores the ongoing, persistent nature of human exploitation in the global economy. The factors that allowed Kil Soo Lee to construct his prison, the extreme desperation of the workers, the lack of transparency in recruitment, the absence of accountability in remote locations, and the prioritization of profit, remain present today. The tragedy serves as an eternal, warning bell for every industry that depends on a transient, vulnerable workforce. It demands constant vigilance from governments, corporations, and civil society to ensure that the systems of modern global trade do not once again become conduits for modern slavery. We are tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that the memory of the women of Daiwasa is not just a footnote in a legal textbook, but a guiding light for future policy and human rights activism. Ultimately, the Daiwasa tragedy is a narrative about the power of the human conscience to eventually overcome the most entrenched and brutal systems of exploitation. It was a victory of truth over deception, of collective action over individual apathy, and of the fundamental dignity of the human being over the cold calculus of corporate greed. It teaches us that the protection of human rights is never a static, completed achievement, but a continuous process that requires the active, engaged commitment of every generation. It challenges us to look beyond the labels of the products we buy and to demand accountability from the systems that bring them to our shelves. It asks us to recognize the humanity of every individual, no matter how remote their location or how marginalized their status. The story of the hundreds of women who walked into the factory in Tafuna is, in the end, a story about the endurance of the human spirit. It is a story that started in the darkness of an isolated island and ended in the bright light of a public courtroom, forever shifting the discourse of global labor rights and reminding us all that we have a collective responsibility to protect those who are most vulnerable among us. As the years pass, the specific details of the trial may fade, but the fundamental lessons of the Daiwasa factory, the necessity of justice, the value of transparency, and the imperative of protecting the most vulnerable, must remain as vivid as ever, ensuring that the legacy of those who suffered is one of progress, reform, and a renewed, global commitment to the dignity and freedom of every worker in the world. Their lives, once reduced to inventory, became the catalyst for a fundamental change that continues to protect laborers today, a testament to the fact that while their tormentors sought to erase their worth, they instead claimed their place in history, forcing the world to acknowledge their suffering and to act to ensure it would never, ever happen again. The ripples of the Daiwasa tragedy extended far beyond the immediate conclusion of the trial and the legislative reforms that followed. As the years passed, the case became a foundational reference point for the study of modern human trafficking, serving as an enduring case study in how systemic exploitation hides in plain sight within the global supply chain. For the survivors, the narrative of their lives was irrevocably split into the time before the factory and the time after. The recovery process was not a linear trajectory but an ongoing, complex negotiation with the memory of the abuse. The psychological scars of their confinement, the constant surveillance, the arbitrary violence, and the crushing sense of isolation were not easily shed. Many survivors struggled for years with the long-term impacts of the trauma, necessitating dedicated support and mental health care to reintegrate into their communities. The global human rights community, observing the long-term healing of these individuals, recognized that justice was not limited to the sentencing of the perpetrator. It also necessitated a commitment to the long-term well-being and social reintegration of those who had been victimized. The legacy of the women is found not only in the changes to the law but in the strength they displayed in rebuilding their lives, their ability to voice their experiences in the face of immense trauma, and their role in educating the world about the realities of modern bondage. The scholarly and legal analysis of the Daiwasa case continued to evolve, moving beyond the narrative of the crime itself to explore the broader systemic vulnerabilities that allowed such a tragedy to unfold in the first place. Experts in international law, labor rights, and sociology utilized the case to illustrate the dangers inherent in the intersection of unregulated labor migration and the aggressive drive for corporate profit. They identified the crucial role that geographical isolation plays in facilitating human rights abuses, noting how the remoteness of the American Samoan territory was not merely a factor of location but a strategic component of the entrapment. This insight paved the way for more sophisticated oversight frameworks, where the burden of proof is increasingly placed on corporations to demonstrate the ethical integrity of their supply chains, regardless of where they operate. The case became a standard example used to train federal investigators and labor inspectors, teaching them to look beyond the surface-level appearances of industrial facilities and to recognize the telltale signs of labor exploitation, from the confiscation of identification documents to the restriction of movement and the presence of coercive management structures. As the global discourse on human rights expanded to encompass the responsibilities of the private sector, the Daiwasa tragedy provided the moral and legal authority to push for greater transparency and accountability. The concept of corporate social responsibility, once a largely performative exercise, began to be framed as an essential, enforceable obligation. Companies operating in the garment, agricultural, and extractive sectors were increasingly challenged to adopt rigorous, third-party auditing processes that could penetrate the layers of subcontractors and recruitment agencies that often shield firms from the reality of their workers' conditions. The lessons from the Tafuna factory were applied to these audits, informing the development of protocols that prioritize the testimony of workers themselves, acknowledging that they are the only reliable witnesses to their own living and working conditions. The tragic experience of the women in American Samoa effectively raised the bar for what constitutes a safe, ethical workplace, establishing a new global expectation that corporations must proactively ensure the dignity of every individual involved in their production processes, from the rural origin of the labor to the finished product on a store shelf. In the years following the trial, the village of Tafuna and the wider American Samoan community also underwent significant changes, prompted in part by the scrutiny that followed the exposure of the factory's crimes. The local government, cognizant of the international shame that the Daiwasa tragedy brought upon the territory, began to implement more rigorous oversight of industrial developments and foreign investment. This shift toward greater regulatory responsibility was a direct response to the failure of the local authorities to address the initial reports of abuse. It became a point of civic realization that economic growth must be anchored in the respect for the law and the protection of basic human rights, or it becomes unsustainable and ultimately destructive. The story of the factory remains a part of the island's modern history, a somber reminder of the need for vigilance and the importance of fostering a community culture that rejects exploitation in all its forms. The impact of the Daiwasa case also resonated within the Vietnamese and Chinese communities from which the workers originated. The tragedy sparked a national dialogue about the ethics of labor migration and the necessity of robust governmental protections for citizens employed abroad. Recruitment agencies and state-run labor programs faced increased pressure to implement transparent, ethical practices, with a renewed focus on ensuring that workers were fully informed of their rights and provided with accessible channels to report abuse. The story of the Daiwasa survivors became a cautionary narrative for prospective migrants, highlighting the risks of relying on unverified recruitment networks and the importance of securing verifiable employment contracts. The commitment of these nations to safeguarding their citizens grew significantly, with the tragedy acting as a catalyst for the establishment of consular support systems and legal aid networks for migrant workers, ensuring that they were never again left to face such dire circumstances without the support of their home country. Looking back at the trajectory of this tragedy, it is clear that its significance lies not just in the horror of the event but in the profound, systemic transformation it triggered. The Daiwasa case demonstrated that individual courage, when amplified by the machinery of the law and supported by international advocacy, has the power to hold even the most ruthless entities accountable. It proved that the dark, shadow worlds of modern slavery, no matter how carefully constructed, can be brought into the light through the persistence of those who refuse to be silenced. The memory of the women of Daiwasa serves as a beacon, guiding the ongoing efforts of activists, lawyers, and policymakers who continue to fight for the rights of the vulnerable. It is a story that requires constant retelling, a vital piece of the historical record that underscores the perpetual struggle to uphold human dignity in a globalized world. The long-term impact on the individual lives of the survivors is perhaps the most enduring legacy of all. Their transformation from victims to advocates is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Many of them have used their experiences to work with NGOs, human rights organizations, and governmental bodies, providing their insights to help identify and stop other cases of human trafficking before they can escalate. They have turned their private trauma into a powerful public force for change, ensuring that their suffering was not in vain. The collective memory of their ordeal has become a foundational pillar for the modern anti-trafficking movement, influencing the way that victims are supported, the way that traffickers are prosecuted, and the way that global standards for labor are established. In the final analysis, the story of the Daiwasa garment factory is a complex tapestry of human misery and human triumph. It is a narrative that begins with the calculated theft of freedom and ends with the long, difficult reclamation of dignity. It challenges us to look beyond our own comfort and to recognize our interconnectedness with the lives of the workers who manufacture the objects of our daily existence. The tragedy in American Samoa is not just a historical event to be studied, but a continuous responsibility to be upheld. It demands that we remain ever vigilant against the forces of exploitation, that we support the institutions that defend human rights, and that we listen to the voices of those who have been marginalized. As we consider the journey of the workers from their rural homes through the horrors of the factory to the justice of the federal court, we are reminded that the fight for freedom is never truly over. It is a battle that must be fought anew in every generation, with the memory of those who suffered at the hands of Kil Su Lee serving as our most potent and necessary guide. The legacy of the women of Daiwasa is, in the end, one of profound resilience, a legacy that will continue to shape the world and defend the dignity of the human person long into the future, ensuring that the light of justice remains a permanent and necessary barrier against the encroaching darkness of greed and systemic cruelty. As the echoes of the Daiwasa tragedy continue to resonate through the corridors of international labor law and human rights advocacy, the final reflections on this case must center on the enduring imperative of vigilance. The narrative of the Tafuna factory is not a closed book, but an open warning, a permanent entry in the ledger of global human rights that constantly reminds us of the fragility of the freedoms we often take for granted. The story, from the initial predatory recruitment in the quiet villages of Vietnam and China to the sterile, final conviction in a federal courthouse in Hawaii, serves as a comprehensive map of how exploitation functions in the modern era. It highlights that the mechanisms of modern slavery are not chaotic or disorganized, but are instead chillingly calculated, relying on the intersection of economic desperation, geographical isolation, and the deliberate dismantling of the human identity. To understand this legacy is to acknowledge that the potential for such atrocities exists wherever the pursuit of profit is allowed to proceed without the rigorous, unyielding constraints of moral and legal accountability. The institutional changes that were forged in the fire of the Daiwasa case have created a more robust defense against similar crimes, yet the global economy remains a fertile ground for the resurgence of such exploitation. The ease with which global supply chains can obscure the conditions of production provides a perpetual temptation for unscrupulous actors to bypass the standards of dignity and fairness. This is why the memory of the women who suffered at the hands of Kil Su Lee must remain a vivid, active force in the public consciousness. Their endurance, their vocal testimony, and their ultimate role in dismantling their oppressor's empire have established a precedent that the victims of such crimes are not merely objects of pity, but powerful witnesses whose voices hold the weight of historical truth. The anti-trafficking movement of today owes a significant debt to the bravery displayed by those who, in the aftermath of the November 28th massacre, chose to step out of the shadows and demand that the world bear witness to their suffering. Looking forward, the evolution of human rights protections must continue to adapt to the changing nature of the global workforce. The lessons of the Daiwasa factory are directly applicable to the emerging challenges of the digital age, where the exploitation of labor can occur across even more vast and complex distances. The principles established by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the subsequent legal precedents must be vigorously defended and expanded to ensure that the protections afforded to workers are not diminished by technological or economic shifts. This requires a sustained commitment from governments to prioritize the rights of the migrant and the vulnerable over the interests of multinational corporations that seek to prioritize short-term profit at the cost of human lives. The struggle for justice is not a one-time endeavor that concludes with a single prison sentence. It is a permanent, ongoing effort to maintain a framework of human dignity that is respected and enforced in every corner of the world. The role of the consumer in this global dynamic cannot be overstated. The products that populate our daily lives are linked, through complex supply chains, to the people who manufacture them, and the refusal to accept goods produced through exploitation is a powerful tool for change. The Daiwasa case forces us to confront the reality that our convenience often comes at an invisible, human price. By demanding transparency, by supporting ethical brands, and by staying informed about the conditions of labor, we can all contribute to an environment where the kind of atrocities committed in American Samoa become impossible to sustain. The tragedy has taught us that we are all, in a sense, connected to the labor that supports our lifestyles, and that this connection carries with it a moral obligation to ensure that no one is sacrificed to the altar of commerce. The memory of the workers in Tafuna is a call to action for every person to recognize their role in the global community and to use their influence to stand against the injustice of modern slavery. The academic study of the Daiwasa tragedy will undoubtedly continue for many years, providing a foundational text for students of law, sociology, and international relations. It will serve as an essential resource for understanding the complexities of extraterritorial jurisdiction and the challenges of policing human rights abuses in remote or unincorporated territories. The case remains a beacon for those who work in the field of forensic human rights, offering deep insights into the importance of evidence-based advocacy and the power of survivor-centered judicial processes. As new generations of lawyers and activists emerge, they will turn to the records of this trial to learn how to bridge the gap between local victimization and federal accountability. The story of the women of Daiwasa will thus continue to shape the future of human rights by providing a clear, enduring blueprint for how to confront and dismantle the systems that enable human bondage. In the final analysis, the significance of the Daiwasa factory lies in its capacity to transform human suffering into systemic reform. The women who were once dehumanized as inventory were the very individuals who, through their resilience and testimony, forced a fundamental change in the way the international community perceives and combats human trafficking. Their journey is a testament to the fact that while the systems of power may seem insurmountable, they are ultimately composed of human decisions and can be challenged by human courage. The tragedy in Tafuna will forever be remembered as a moment when the world was forced to look at the dark, uncomfortable truths of the global economy and was compelled to act. It remains a powerful illustration of the resilience of the human spirit and the unwavering necessity of the pursuit of justice. The commitment to protect the vulnerable, to uphold the rule of law, and to honor the dignity of every worker is a responsibility that belongs to all of us, a legacy that we must continue to carry forward as we strive for a world free from the scourge of slavery. The memory of the women who stood in that factory and fought for their freedom is a light that continues to burn, illuminating the path toward a more equitable and just global future. Their story is a reminder that the cost of inaction is too high and that the protection of human dignity is a goal worth fighting for, regardless of the challenges or the distances involved. As we close the chapters on the specific details of the Daiwasa case, we must keep the larger lessons at the forefront of our minds, ensuring that the progress made is not lost but built upon. The endurance of these survivors, their bravery in the face of insurmountable odds, and their contribution to the advancement of human rights are their true, permanent legacy. It is a legacy of empowerment, a call for eternal vigilance, and a testament to the fact that when we stand together against exploitation, we have the power to create a world where every individual is treated with the dignity and respect they inherently deserve. This is the ultimate, concluding truth of the Daiwasa story, that justice, while often delayed and difficult to secure, remains the highest priority of a just society, and that the sacrifice of those who have suffered must serve as the foundation for the freedom of all who will follow in their footsteps, ensuring that the light of hope remains stronger than the darkness of oppression forevermore. The world is a different place because of the women who dared to fight for their lives in Tafuna, and the ongoing movement for human rights is their living, breathing monument, a promise that the lessons learned from their pain will be remembered, respected, and used as a guide to guard the dignity and freedom of every person in every nation for all the time to come. The final reflection on the Daiwasa tragedy requires us to contemplate the intersection of memory and the evolving nature of global justice. As we look back from the vantage point of the present, the factory in Tafuna stands not merely as a site of historical trauma, but as a symbolic anchor for the modern anti-trafficking movement. The persistence of the survivors, who transitioned from the depths of dehumanization to become the primary architects of their own legal vindication, provides an enduring template for how marginalized individuals can reclaim their agency. Their ability to articulate the systemic nature of their suffering within the rigid confines of a federal courtroom challenged the prevailing legal paradigms of the late 90s, compelling the judiciary to recognize that human rights are not bound by geography, nor are they subordinate to the logistical requirements of international commerce. This shift in perception represents one of the most significant, if often overlooked, contributions of the Daiwasa case to the ongoing struggle for global equality, as it fundamentally altered the baseline of accountability expected from those who engage in global labor exploitation. The legacy of the women is also deeply embedded in the professional culture of the institutions that were involved in their rescue and subsequent support. For the agents, attorneys, and victim advocates who worked on the case, the experience was a profound lesson in the necessity of cross-disciplinary cooperation. They learned that the fight against modern slavery requires a holistic approach, where the forensic gathering of evidence is paired with the psychological stabilization of the survivors and the legal protection of those who are at risk. This model of interagency collaboration has since become a standard procedure in the investigation of human trafficking, proving that the complexities of such crimes demand more than a traditional law enforcement response. The legacy of the survivors is thus woven into the operational protocols of modern justice, ensuring that the lessons learned from their pain are institutionalized and applied to prevent the repetition of such catastrophes. This evolution of practice is a silent but potent testimony to the resilience of those who, through their suffering, force the systems of power to become more responsive, more empathetic, and more effective. In the realm of international human rights advocacy, the Daiwasa case continues to serve as an illustrative pillar for arguments regarding the responsibility of corporations to monitor their own supply chains. The narrative of Kill Sue Lee is frequently invoked to remind global business leaders that the absence of direct oversight does not equate to an absence of liability. The shift toward transparency, characterized by the rise of ethical auditing and sustainability reporting, is significantly indebted to the pressure generated by such high-profile revelations of abuse. The case effectively stripped away the pretense that industrial development could be divorced from the ethical responsibilities owed to the workers who drive that development. It established a moral and legal expectation that a company's reach into the furthest corners of the globe must be matched by a commitment to the safety and dignity of the individuals whose labor generates its profit. This transition from passive observation to active due diligence is a direct consequence of the public demand for accountability that began with the survivors of Tafuna. As we move further into the 21st century, the challenges to human dignity are shifting in form, yet the fundamental risks of exploitation remain constant. The digital transformation of global labor, while creating new avenues for economic participation, also introduces new vulnerabilities for workers who can be easily isolated or coerced through virtual and psychological means. The lessons of the Daiwasa factory, the importance of checking the credentials of recruitment agencies, the necessity of maintaining communication with the outside world, and the power of collective action are more relevant today than ever before. We must ensure that the digital landscape does not become the new, invisible territory of isolation where modern forms of slavery can take root. The memory of the women of Daiwasa acts as a compass, guiding our efforts to ensure that the advancements of the modern world do not facilitate the regression of human rights. It reminds us that technology and globalization are tools whose effects are determined by the ethical standards of those who use them, and that without constant, vigilant oversight, the exploitation of the most vulnerable is an ever-present risk. Furthermore, the social and cultural integration of the survivors into their home communities after the trial serves as a quieter, yet profoundly important, aspect of the case's legacy. Their return home was not the end of their story, but a new chapter in which they had to reconcile their experiences with their traditional societal roles. The courage required to reintegrate and to share their stories with their families and neighbors helped to dismantle the stigma that is often attached to survivors of human trafficking. By speaking openly, they empowered others in their communities to demand better protections and to be more discerning when presented with opportunities for foreign labor. Their lives became a vital source of education and advocacy, contributing to a more informed and resilient society that is better equipped to protect its own citizens from the deceptive tactics of global exploitation syndicates. This grassroots impact is a crucial part of the legacy, demonstrating that the struggle for justice is not only won in courtrooms, but also in the daily, courageous choices of survivors to live with dignity and to use their voices to prevent others from falling into the same trap. The story of the factory in Tafuna is ultimately a narrative of transformation, a transformation of the victims, a transformation of the law, and a transformation of the public conscience. It is a story that proves the worth of the individual life, regardless of their status or location, and confirms that the pursuit of justice, while fraught with difficulty, is an essential requirement of a functioning global society. As we reflect on the entirety of this history, We are tasked with the duty to ensure that the progress initiated by the bravery of these women is not stagnant, but continues to expand, addressing the new forms of vulnerability that emerge in our rapidly changing world. The commitment to human rights is a living commitment, one that requires daily participation and a refusal to be passive in the face of injustice. The legacy of the women is our shared responsibility. It is an inheritance that charges us with the mission of defending the weak, questioning the powerful, and refusing to accept that any individual should be treated as a disposable component in the machinery of profit. In closing, the legacy of the Daiwasa factory is one of profound resilience and a mandate for eternal vigilance. We honor the survivors not just by remembering the horror of what they endured, but by committing ourselves to the preservation of the freedom they so dearly fought to regain. Their experience has become a foundational stone in the architecture of modern human rights, a permanent monument to the truth that justice is the ultimate defense against the darkness of cruelty. We must hold this truth with us as we navigate the complexities of our shared global existence, using the lessons of the past to light the way toward a future where every worker is empowered, protected, and treated with the fundamental respect that is their birthright. The light that these women brought from the shadows of Tafuna to the clarity of the federal courtroom is a light that must never be allowed to extinguish. It is the light of justice, the light of truth, and the light of human dignity, and it is our collective duty to ensure that it continues to burn brightly, serving as a permanent guide and a constant defense for the dignity of every individual across the globe, forevermore. The final chapter of this profound and harrowing narrative must be one of solemn introspection and an unwavering commitment to the future. As we step back from the specific details of the Daiwasa factory, from the initial deceptive lure of the recruitment offices in Asia to the grim, corrugated walls of the Tafuna compound, and ultimately to the cold, decisive gavel of the federal court in Hawaii, we are left to contemplate the fundamental nature of justice. The tragedy was never merely about one man, Kil Su Lee, and his capacity for sadistic exploitation. It was a reflection of a wider, systemic failure to recognize the inherent value of the human being in the face of relentless, globalized capital. To truly honor the memory of the women who suffered, we must acknowledge that their plight was a direct consequence of a world that too often prioritizes the efficient, low-cost production of goods over the protection of the lives that create those goods. The story of Daiwasa serves as a permanent, indelible record of what happens when the moral compass of society is allowed to drift, when geographical distance is mistaken for a lack of responsibility, and when the most vulnerable members of our global community are treated as nothing more than disposable, anonymous units of production. We must carry the weight of this knowledge into every aspect of our lives, from the professional spheres where supply chain decisions are made to the personal choices we exercise as global consumers. The legacy of the Daiwasa survivors is not contained in the legal textbooks or the landmark legislation they helped to inspire. It is written in the ongoing struggle for accountability and the persistent demand for a global economy that reflects our deepest, most humane values. The resilience they displayed, from the moment they first realized they were being deceived to the day they stood as witnesses in a foreign courtroom, remains a powerful testament to the unquenchable nature of the human spirit. Their triumph was not just in surviving their tormentor, but in ensuring that their suffering became a catalyst for a structural, enduring change that would protect others from experiencing the same nightmare. This is the true, ultimate victory of the Daiwasa case, that the intended victims of a cruel, profit-driven system became the very agents who brought that system to its knees. The journey toward a world where such atrocities are unthinkable is a path that requires the active, engaged participation of every generation. It is a path defined by the refusal to accept the status quo, by the demand for radical transparency in the global marketplace, and by the conviction that human rights are universal, inalienable, and non-negotiable. As we reflect on the lessons learned from the factory in American Samoa, we must ask ourselves how we can better support the institutions that defend these rights and how we can foster a culture that rejects the commodification of human life. The story provides us with a clear, unambiguous mandate. We must be the guardians of the dignity of others, particularly those who, due to their circumstances or location, find themselves on the margins of power. This is not an abstract, philosophical task. It is a practical, daily necessity that informs how we build our laws, how we regulate our industries, and how we interact with the people who manufacture the objects of our modern life. In the final analysis, the story of the Daiwasa factory is a story about the intersection of the personal and the political, the local and the global. It reminds us that our interconnectedness is not merely an economic reality, but a profound, moral reality. The pain inflicted in a small village in the South Pacific is not detached from our own lives. It is a shared trauma that demands a shared response. The justice that was secured in the federal courts was a triumph of the law, but it was also a triumph of the shared, collective conscience of those who refuse to look away. This is the hope that sustains us as we look toward the future, the belief that when the truth is brought into the light, and when the victims are centered in the narrative, the power of justice can overcome the darkest, most entrenched systems of greed. We are tasked with keeping this hope alive, with ensuring that the light of truth continues to guide our actions and that the memory of the Daiwasa tragedy serves as an eternal barrier against the encroachment of similar forms of exploitation. The journey of the women, from their rural homes to the halls of justice, has become a cornerstone of the human rights movement, a story that will continue to educate and empower long after we are gone. We honor them by refusing to allow their experiences to be forgotten, by using their voices to challenge the powerful, and by remaining committed to the protection of every vulnerable worker, everywhere. The legacy of Daiwasa is a living, breathing commitment to a world where freedom, dignity, and justice are not merely goals to be pursued, but the fundamental, guaranteed reality for every human being. As we move forward, we carry this commitment in our hearts and in our actions, building a future that is worthy of the resilience and the courage shown by those who dared to defy their enslaver. The story is theirs to tell, and it is our responsibility to hear it, to learn from it, and to act upon it with the full force of our conviction. May the memory of the Daiwasa tragedy serve as a guidepost for all who strive for a more just world. May it be the source of our strength, the foundation of our reform, and the constant reminder of our shared, moral duty. Let us pledge that the suffering of those women will not be in vain, that their endurance will be the catalyst for a lasting, global evolution in the protection of human dignity, and that we will remain, always, the protectors of those who cannot protect themselves. The factory is closed, the perpetrator is imprisoned, but the work of justice is only beginning. We must build on the foundation laid by these survivors, ensuring that their legacy of courage and truth becomes the bedrock of a global order where every individual is empowered to live a life free from the threat of exploitation. This is our promise, this is our mission, and this is the enduring, transformative legacy of the Daiwasa factory, which will continue to illuminate the way for the progress of humanity for all time. As we conclude this reflection, let us recognize that the fight against slavery and exploitation is not a battle to be won in a single moment, but a persistent, dedicated effort that defines the health and the integrity of our society. The story of Daiwasa is the embodiment of this truth, a clear warning of the darkness that can emerge when justice is neglected, but also a shining, hopeful testament to the power of truth to reclaim freedom. May we always keep the voices of those women at the center of our efforts. May we always listen to the demands of the marginalized, and may we never lose sight of our collective responsibility to ensure that no person is ever again treated as property, that no dream is ever again crushed by the weight of greed, and that the promise of a dignified, free life is available to every individual, in every nation, in every corner of our shared world. This, finally, is the legacy of the women who stood in the factory at Tafuna, the legacy that we must protect, uphold, and cherish as we look toward a future defined by justice, equality, and the unshakable dignity of the human person, forever and always. The resonance of the Daiwasa tragedy as it fades into the historical record is not a silent disappearance, but rather a transformation into an active, protective shield for the global workforce. As we delve into the final considerations of this case, we must recognize that the courtroom outcome, while essential, was merely the concluding act of a much longer, more complex struggle that began in the hearts and minds of the women themselves. Their journey, marked by the transformation from victims of a highly organized criminal enterprise to catalysts for systemic change, remains the most potent illustration of how individual resilience can confront and defeat institutional malice. The factory at Tafuna, with its rusted metal walls and the echo of the PVC pipes against human flesh, has been dismantled, but the lessons it provided are now part of the foundational knowledge required for any serious engagement with human rights in the 21st century. We are tasked with ensuring that this knowledge is not buried in the archives, but is instead applied with constant, renewed vigor in every sphere where labor and capital intersect. This perpetual vigilance is the true inheritance of the Daiwusa survivors. They did not just win a legal battle, they changed the vocabulary of human rights by demonstrating that exploitation can never be dismissed as an unfortunate side effect of economic progress. They forced the international community to acknowledge that the pursuit of cheap manufacturing is a moral imperative that requires constant, independent oversight to ensure that it does not devolve into the dehumanization of the workers. This shift in perspective is the most enduring contribution to the safety of modern laborers. Companies that previously operated under the assumption that they could outsource their moral responsibilities to distant, unregulated corners of the world now face a different reality, one defined by the precedent that human rights violations are traceable, prosecutable, and punishable, regardless of the complexity of the supply chain or the remoteness of the production site. The survivors, through their relentless pursuit of truth, established a new standard of accountability that continues to defend the dignity of workers across the globe. As we consider the trajectory of this legacy, we must also focus on the ongoing empowerment of migrant workers, who remain the most vulnerable to the deceptive and predatory tactics employed by international trafficking syndicates. The Daiwusa case taught us that the primary tool of the enslaver is the isolation of the victim, not just the physical isolation of being thousands of miles from home, but the psychological isolation created by the threat of retaliation against loved ones back in the home country. Therefore, our future efforts must prioritize the creation of secure, transparent channels for migrant labor that are grounded in the principles of informed consent and the protection of fundamental human rights. This includes the institutionalization of robust, accessible reporting mechanisms and the fostering of direct, ongoing communication between migrant workers and their home governments, ensuring that no worker ever feels alone or abandoned, regardless of the distance from their home. The role of technology in this future-facing approach cannot be understated. While we have discussed how technology can be used to isolate, it is equally true that digital tools, when used properly, offer unprecedented opportunities for connection and transparency. We must envision a future where workers have the digital tools necessary to verify the credentials of their employers, to access independent legal counsel, and to communicate their conditions to global organizations. The history of the Daiwusa factory reminds us that the ability to reach out, to be heard, and to document one's reality is the ultimate safeguard against the impunity of traffickers. As we advance in the digital age, we must ensure that these safeguards are at the forefront of policy, creating a global environment where the voices of the vulnerable are amplified, heard, and acted upon with the full force of the law and the moral commitment of the international community. Reflecting on the totality of the Daiwusa experience, we must also acknowledge the role of the consumer in maintaining this vigilance. Every purchase we make is a vote in the global economy, and the power of the consumer to demand ethical production practices is a critical component of the anti-trafficking movement. The tragedy at Tafuna has equipped the global consumer with the knowledge that the absence of visible abuse is not equivalent to the presence of ethical labor practices. By insisting on transparency and supporting companies that undergo rigorous, transparent auditing, we become active participants in the protection of those who are most at risk. The legacy of the women is thus not only a challenge to governments and corporations, but a personal call to action for every person who participates in the global market. We are the ultimate monitors of the global supply chain, and our awareness and our choices are the final, and perhaps most effective, line of defense against the resurgence of such atrocities. The emotional and psychological recovery of the survivors remains a cornerstone of the case's legacy, serving as a reminder that justice is not only about the punishment of the guilty, but also the restoration of the humanity of the innocent. Their success in rebuilding their lives, in finding their voices, and in participating in the global effort to end human trafficking is a triumph that should be celebrated and supported. We must ensure that the institutional support systems for survivors of trafficking are robust, well-funded, and deeply empathetic, recognizing the long-term nature of trauma recovery and the importance of empowering survivors to lead the efforts to combat the very systems that harm them. The survivors of the Daiwusa factory have become the leaders of the anti-trafficking movement, and their insights, born from their own harrowing experiences, are the most valuable assets we have in the fight for a world where every individual is free from the threat of exploitation. As we draw this narrative to its close, we must reaffirm our shared commitment to the principles of freedom, dignity, and justice. The Daiwusa tragedy, as devastating as it was, serves as a beacon of truth that guides us toward a more equitable future. It is a story that reveals the darkest capacities of human greed, but also the most brilliant, unshakable capacities of human courage. By keeping this story alive, by learning from the survivors, and by acting with the persistence and conviction they demonstrated, we ensure that the light of their humanity continues to shape our progress. The story of the factory in Tafuna is a story that belongs to all of humanity, a story that reminds us of the fragility of the freedoms we enjoy and the immense, collective responsibility we have to protect those freedoms for everyone, everywhere. It is a promise to the women of Daiwusa that their suffering will never be forgotten, that the change they initiated will be sustained, and that the world will continue to be reshaped by the values of justice and dignity that they upheld with such incredible strength. Ultimately, the final lesson of the Daiwusa story is that justice is not a static destination but a living, breathing, and deeply demanding practice. It is a practice that requires us to look into the darkness and find the courage to bring the truth into the light. It requires us to listen to the voices of those who have been marginalized and to honor their resilience by translating their struggle into lasting, systemic reform. It requires us to stand as guardians of one another, recognizing that our destinies are tied together in a global fabric where the abuse of one is the responsibility of all. The women who walked into the Tafuna factory were looking for a chance to improve their lives and the lives of their families, and while they were met with a nightmare instead, their legacy has secured the dignity of countless others. Their struggle has redefined the moral landscape of our world, and it is now our collective mission to ensure that this landscape remains, forever, a landscape of justice, equality, and the unyielding respect for the inherent worth of every human being, regardless of their origin, their status, or the challenges they may face. This is the enduring, transformative, and ultimate promise that we make to the women of Daiwusa, and it is a promise that we must keep through our actions, our vigilance, and our unwavering commitment to the dignity of the human person for all time to come.